In 1850 Alabama, a wealthy family seemed untouchable until every one of their daughters vanished before turning 16. No illness, no struggle, no trace, just silence, and the chilling legend of the oak tree that locals still fear to this day. What cursed the Ellisons? And why does the pattern continue? This is Founding Chronicles. Subscribe now, because some horrors refuse to stay buried. The Ellisons of Southern Alabama were not merely wealthy, they were symbols of ambition rewarded, prosperity carved from raw land, and reputation built with unshakable pride. Their plantation, known to locals as Magnolia Hill, rose from the landscape like a monument to both fortune and stubborn will. A white-columned mansion stood at the crest of rolling fields, its long veranda wrapping 3 sides of the house, where Josiah Ellison, the family patriarch, liked to survey the empire he had built. Drive leading to the mansion was a statement all its own. Ancient oak trees arched overhead, forming a tunnel of shade so complete that visitors often described it as walking into another world. At the end of this shaded passage, the iron gates of Magnolia Hill opened not just to farmland, but to a stage where status, hospitality, and legacy were constantly on display. Josiah had arrived in Alabama with little more than a small inheritance, and 3 enslaved people he had unwillingly inherited from his father. In those first years, he worked side by side with them, clearing brush, cutting furrows, and sowing the first rows of cotton. By the 1830s, his relentless drive and a series of ruthless land deals expanded his holdings to more than 500 acres. Within just a decade, his name was spoken with a mix of admiration and caution. To his peers, he was a man of vision and calculation. To those who worked beneath him, he was exacting, tireless, and frighteningly unyielding. The house itself was the crown jewel of that ambition. Completed in 1838, it was built to impress, with dark mahogany interiors, grand staircases, and chandeliers imported from New Orleans. Josiah was proudest of the carved wooden banister spiraling through the center hall, a piece created by a carpenter enslaved specifically for the task, whose artistry elevated the house into something locals whispered was fit for royalty. But the Ellisons' prestige did not rest on Josiah alone. His wife, Elizabeth Montgomery Ellison, brought with her not only the grace expected of a planter's daughter, but also a dowry that secured their rise in Alabama society. She was known for her delicate beauty amber eyes, pale hair styled in the latest fashions, and for a quiet intensity that unsettled those closest to her. She rarely appeared in public without clutching a silver hand mirror, an heirloom from her family's lineage in Virginia, its handle etched with curling vines around the Montgomery crest. To Elizabeth, the mirror was not merely ornamental. It was said she studied it obsessively, staring into its glass long after polite society would have considered it appropriate. Together, Josiah and Elizabeth cultivated an image of prosperity and benevolence. During a drought, Josiah opened his storehouses to struggling neighbors, offering grain at reduced prices or none at all. When scarlet fever swept through the county, Elizabeth sent their family physician to treat families who could not afford care. These acts of charity earned them admiration, though more cynical observers whispered they were performed as much for prestige as compassion. Their children completed the portrait of a blessed household. The eldest son, Thomas, was destined to inherit the estate, while the daughters Margaret, Catherine, Josephine, and little Sarah were spoken of as models of refinement. Each birth had been celebrated with lavish christenings, attended by society's elite. The Ellison girls were dressed in fine silks, tutored in French, and expected to become wives worthy of continuing the family's legacy. Sundays showcased the family's stature. They arrived at St. James Episcopal Church in a polished carriage drawn by 4 matched bays. Josiah, dressed in impeccable linen, served as a vestryman, donating generously to building funds. Elizabeth taught Sunday school, her presence in the front pew with the children at her side, reinforcing the family's image of piety. Afterward, they often invited the minister and select families to Magnolia Hill, where Elizabeth's renowned peach cobbler was served beneath the glow of polished silver candelabras. On the surface, the Ellisons embodied the very ideal of the antebellum South: prosperity, refinement, and stability secured by land and lineage. Their gatherings, especially the annual Christmas ball, were legendary, drawing guests from as far as Mobile and Montgomery. On those nights, the house blazed with candlelight, music drifted through the halls, and the plantation seemed untouchable, suspended in wealth and tradition. But beneath the polish, the first hints of unease had already begun to ripple. Some said it was the land itself, that Josiah had purchased property long avoided by locals who whispered of old sects and forgotten burials. Others noticed Elizabeth's restless habits, her late-night walks beneath the trees, her choice of books considered improper for women, her moments of distraction when her gaze lingered too long toward the eastern boundary of the fields. The enslaved community carried their own warnings. They claimed that strange flowers near the old oak bloomed with unnatural sighs, releasing a scent that caused headaches and vivid dreams. A few said they had seen their mistress conversing with empty air beneath that very tree, as though answering someone only she could perceive. To the public, Magnolia Hill was a house of fortune and faith. But to those who served within its walls, or watched from the shadows, it was already a house with something buried just beneath the surface, something waiting to be claimed. Though Magnolia Hill shone brightly to the outside world, within its walls and fields, unsettling whispers began to take root. The enslaved people who kept the estate running noticed things first. They claimed the old oak tree on the eastern edge of the property behaved unnaturally. Flowers planted near its roots grew larger and faster than any others on the grounds, their blooms heavy and overly fragrant, releasing a sickly sweet perfume that clung to the air. Those who worked near the tree said the scent caused headaches, sometimes even vivid, disturbing dreams of faceless women moving among the branches. Bessie, Elizabeth's personal maid, confided in others that she had seen her mistress beneath the tree more than once, speaking quietly to someone who wasn't there. She described Elizabeth's voice as low, deliberate, and in a language no one recognized. When confronted, Elizabeth dismissed these tales as servants' superstitions, but even members of the household staff noticed her wandering at odd hours, silver mirror in hand, her pale face illuminated by moonlight. The governess, Miss Porter, kept her own record. A Jew-educated woman from Boston fallen on hard times. She was accustomed to reason and order, but her private journals began to fill with troubling observations. Her notes from June of 1845 describe conversations with Margaret, the eldest daughter, who is preparing for her 16th birthday. Margaret confided in me today about her dreams. She sees a woman with hollow eyes standing beneath the oak tree, calling her by name. Though the figure never speaks aloud, Margaret insists she hears her voice within her mind, saying, "Daughter, come home." I assured her it was but the result of youthful imagination. Yet I find myself unsettled. There is a quality in her gaze now that seems haunted. Days later, Miss Porter recorded an even more chilling entry. Margaret's dreams have worsened. She now speaks of not one, but many women, all dressed in white, their eyes hollow, their song wordless, yet unforgettable. She hummed the tune for me, a strange, dissonant melody that raised the hairs on my neck. When I urged her to confide in her mother, Margaret became upset. She said only, "Mother already knows." She has always known they would come for me. Other signs grew harder to ignore. Moses, the aging gardener, refused to plant anything near the oak tree, claiming its roots belonged to others, not to us. Samuel, now grown and serving as Thomas Ellison's valet, once swore he saw pale figures shifting among the branches just before dawn. For his trouble, he was whipped for spreading superstitious nonsense. But his warning stuck in the minds of those who overheard it. Even Josiah, the patriarch, heard rumors he could not quite silence. Older men in town recalled that the land Magnolia Hill sat upon had once been owned by a religious sect, mostly women, who vanished suddenly decades earlier. Locals whispered they had practiced unholy rites beneath the oak before disappearing without a trace. The county had long avoided that tract until Josiah, oblivious to its history, purchased it in his drive to expand out. It was not only the servants and journals that hinted at something wrong. Guests at the Ellisons' gatherings sometimes remarked on faint, inexplicable sounds drifting in from the fields on moonlit nights. A low hum, like voices raised in harmony, but without words, rising and falling as if carried by wind. When asked, Elizabeth would smile politely and say it was merely the workers singing to pass the time. But those who heard it closely insisted it was no song of this world. By 1845, as Margaret's 16th birthday drew near, the Ellison household seemed touched by an unseen presence. The grandeur of the plantation could still dazzle visitors, yet behind its polished veneer, every creak of the oak outside, every whispered dream, every half-heard hum carried the same unspoken question. What was waiting for the Ellison daughters beneath that tree? By the summer of 1845, excitement filled Magnolia Hill. The eldest daughter, Margaret Ellison, was approaching her 16th birthday, a milestone that in Southern society marked her transition from childhood into womanhood. For a planter's daughter, this meant more than cake and gifts. It meant her formal introduction to society, the beginning of courtship, and the promise of continuing the family's legacy. Preparations for the celebration had consumed the household for weeks. Servants polished the chandeliers until they gleamed like crystal fire. Garlands of magnolia and jasmine were woven around the grand staircase, and cooks toiled over Margaret's favorite dishes. A French painter had even been commissioned to capture her portrait in a gown imported from New Orleans. Guests, over 50 of them, including members of the governor's circle, were expected to arrive by carriage, making the ball one of the most important social events of the season. Margaret herself, though, seemed strangely distant. Once lively and curious, she now spent long hours in solitude, gazing at her reflection in mirrors or wandering the gardens with a distracted air. Her siblings noticed the change, and Miss Porter, her governess, documented her growing unease. She hums the tune from her dreams now without realizing it, Porter wrote. At times it sounds almost sweet, and yet it chills me to hear it. When I asked if she still saw the women in white, she whispered, "They're closer now. I think they're waiting." The morning of the ball dawned bright and warm. Margaret rose early, dressed simply, and asked her mother's permission to take a short walk in the gardens, to clear her head before the festivities. Elizabeth, distracted with last-minute arrangements, agreed, instructing her maid Bessie to keep a discreet eye from a distance. Bessie followed as Margaret drifted the manicured flower beds and toward the meadow beyond. The girl moved with a curious purpose, her pale blue muslin dress standing out against the summer blooms. She paused at the fountain, trailed her fingers through the water, then continued toward the eastern edge of the grounds, the direction of the old oak tree. Bessie later testified that Margaret's path seemed deliberate, though subtle enough that a less observant eye might have missed it. Alarmed, she moved closer. For a moment, her attention was pulled away when she noticed a loose chicken pecking near the shed, a bird too valuable to lose. She shooed it back toward its pen, and when she turned back, Margaret was gone. The meadow was small, barely 50 yards before the forest line, yet no figure in blue was visible. Bessie called out. No reply. She hurried forward, heart pounding, searching the tall grass. But Margaret Ellison had vanished out at first, Elizabeth dismissed the report as a nuisance. "She's probably at the spring house, or visiting the stables," she said, barely looking up from directing servants. But as minutes stretched into an hour, unease spread. Carriages began to arrive, guests stepping out in silk and linen, while inside the house the family scoured every room, every corner. Margaret was nowhere by late afternoon. Panic replaced irritation. Josiah organized the household into search parties. Slaves swept the fields and barns. Neighbors arriving for the ball joined the hunt. As dusk fell, the celebration was quietly canceled, with guests offered vague excuses about sudden illness. The Ellison name, so bound to prestige now, trembled on the edge of scandal. The search widened through the night. Lanterns flickered across the fields. Men called her name into the woods, their voices echoing unanswered. Bloodhounds were brought from a nearby plantation, but they circled in confusion at the meadow's edge, whining, unable to follow any trail. By midnight, the household was exhausted and desperate. Then came the discovery. Samuel, Thomas's valet, stumbled upon it at the base of the old oak tree. Lying in the dew-soaked grass was a single white satin slipper, the very pair Elizabeth had commissioned for the birthday ball. The shoe was pristine, unstained, untouched by dew, as if it had just been removed from a living foot. When Josiah knelt to pick it up, he swore it was warm to the touch. The ground around it was undisturbed, no prints, no broken grass, no sign that anyone had stood there. Just the slipper, impossibly preserved in a place where Margaret should never have been. Whispers spread quickly among the searchers. One woman crossed herself, murmuring, "Not natural." Another whispered of the women in white. The overseer silenced them harshly, but the unease remained. In the days that followed, Josiah spared no expense. Advertisements were placed in newspapers across Alabama and Georgia. A Cherokee tracker examined the meadow, only to shake his head and say, "This path is not for me to follow." Desperate, Josiah even permitted a conjure woman from the swamps to perform rites at the oak. She burned herbs and whispered incantations, warning afterward that Margaret had been welcomed home by those beyond the veil. Still, no trace of her was ever found. By August, the Ellison name was whispered with pity rather than admiration. The ball that was meant to cement Margaret's place in society became the event that marked her disappearance. In the county's gossip, a darker question took root. If one daughter had been claimed, who would be next? For 2 years after Margaret's disappearance, Magnolia Hill lived under a cloud of dread. The field still yielded cotton, the house still glittered with candlelight, and the Ellisons maintained their appearances at church and community gatherings. But the old confidence had been stripped away. Elizabeth withdrew more and more into herself, her once radiant beauty dimmed by restless nights and whispered prayers. She carried her silver mirror constantly, clutching it as if it offered protection. The servants claimed they sometimes caught her murmuring to it, as though addressing someone unseen. Josiah, meanwhile, grew harder, more severe, determined to project control, even as his household trembled beneath the weight of what had happened. By the autumn of 1847, it was time for Catherine's 16th birthday. Where Margaret's milestone had been marked by splendor and a ball of 50 guests, Catherine's was prepared in secrecy, shrouded in caution. There would be no grand celebration, this time-only family, and only within the heavily guarded walls of Magnolia Hill. Josiah left nothing to chance. Armed men patrolled the property day and night. The oak tree had been cut down at last, its massive trunk burned to ash, though many whispered that disturbing it would only worsen the curse. Windows in the girls' rooms were fitted with iron bars, and Catherine was never left alone. Even at night, her cousin Harriet shared her chamber, constant watchful companion. Catherine herself was nothing like her sister. Practical, sharp-eyed, and unflinching, she dismissed talk of curses and spirits. "I sleep soundly," she told Miss Porter when asked about dreams. "I have no time for nightmares." What happened to Margaret was tragedy, not fate. Her determination steadied her siblings, who clung to her no-nonsense presence. Still, as her birthday approached, unease grew unbearable. Elizabeth took to her bed, refusing to rise, her health collapsing under the weight of memories. Josiah paced the halls with a loaded pistol at his side. His face drawn in haunted doubt. The day of Catherine's birthday passed quietly. No gatherings, no guests. A small cake was baked, candles lit, and gifts exchanged in a subdued supper. They felt more like a wake than a celebration. Catherine smiled, thanked her family, and retired early, insisting she would prove their fears unfounded simply by rising healthy the next morning. But that morning never came down at dawn. Harriet awoke to a chill in the room. The bed beside her was empty, the covers smoothed, the pillow cold. Catherine's nightgown was laid neatly across the sheets, as if arranged by careful hands. The door remained locked from the inside. The key was still in the keyhole. The barred window was closed, the latch untouched. She had simply vanished. The household erupted in chaos. Josiah burst into the room, disbelief etched into his face as he examined every inch of the chamber. He tore up floorboards, searched closets, even hammered at the bars on the window, but nothing explained it. Catherine was gone, and gone in a way that defied all earthly logic. The servants whispered that the women in white had come again, unhindered by locks and iron. Harriet wept uncontrollably, insisting she had been no more than a few feet away, yet had heard nothing but silence. Elizabeth, upon hearing the news, collapsed into hysterics, screaming that the bargain had not been kept, that the offerings had failed. None could make sense of her words, but they carried a dreadful weight. For the wider community, the second disappearance erased all doubts. Margaret's vanishing might have been explained as elopement, or abduction, or some dark accident. But Catherine's? From a locked and barred room? There was no rational answer, no worldly thief to blame. The Ellison daughters, it seemed, were being taken by something beyond human reach. From that day forward, Magnolia Hill was no longer a house of prestige. It was a house of whispers. Neighbors avoided its gates. Slaves crossed themselves when forced near its grounds. And Josiah, once a symbol of relentless ambition, was now a man visibly breaking, fighting a battle against something he could neither see nor defeat. The Ellisons had lost 2 daughters, both at 16. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, all who knew the family carried the same unspoken fear. There were still 2 more girls left. After Catherine's impossible disappearance, the Ellisons lived in a constant state of dread. The plantation still stood, but it no longer thrived. Workers deserted, claiming the land itself had turned against them. The cotton yield shrank year after year, and Magnolia Hill, once the jewel of southern Alabama, began to rot from within. Elizabeth became a shadow of herself. She no longer taught Sunday school or entertained guests. Instead, she spent long hours in her chamber, silver mirror clutched in her trembling hands, muttering prayers that blurred into chants. Servants whispered that she offered locks of her daughter's hair, drops of blood taken while they slept, in hopes of protecting them from whatever hunted the family. But if bargains had been made, they had already failed. Josiah, once ambitious and unbreakable, grew gaunt. His eyes darted constantly to windows, doors, the tree line. He armed the house as though preparing for siege. Bars on windows, extra locks on doors, even armed guards posted through the night. Yet his measures had not saved Catherine, and everyone knew they would not save the next. That next was Josephine. By 1849, she was nearing her 16th birthday. Unlike her sisters, she showed little fear. Solemn and watchful, Josephine had spent the last years observing her family's slow collapse. She spoke rarely, smiled almost never, and seemed resigned to a fate no one could shield her from. Miss Porter recorded one chilling conversation. She asked me to take Sarah away before April comes. She said, "They won't stop with me. They'll take Sarah too when her time comes. But you can save her. Promise me." I tried to reassure her, but she only shook her head. The women in white always keep their promises. Mother knows it. Father knows it. I am already theirs. As April approached, Josiah's paranoia turned to mania. He dismissed most of the staff, trusting no one outside the family. He slept little, pacing the halls with rifle in hand. Elizabeth, pale and feverish, begged him to abandon Magnolia Hill altogether. "We'll go north," she urged. "Change our name, start again." But Josiah refused. "This is our land," he said. "I built it from nothing. I will not be driven away by shadows." On the eve of Josephine's birthday, the family finally prepared to flee. Josiah, at last broken by desperation, ordered the carriage readied. They would leave before dawn, ride to Mobile, and sail north to his brother in Boston. The trunks were packed, the valuables gathered. For the first time in years, hope flickered in the darkened house. But as the first light touched the horizon, hope died when Josiah stepped outside to fetch his son Thomas, who had been tasked with preparing the horses. He found the carriage waiting, but no horses, no son. Harnesses lay slack, empty, as though the animals had simply ceased to exist. Josiah called out, his voice echoing across the silent fields. There was no reply dot inside the house. Elizabeth clutched little Sarah, whispering frantic prayers. Josephine stood calmly in the entry hall, dressed in white. She looked not frightened, but serene, her face illuminated by the pale dawn light seeping through the shutters. And it began humming. Faint at first, like wind stirring through branches, then stronger, layered, unmistakably voices. Women's voices, wordless yet beckoning, filling the air with a melody that pressed against the chest like a heartbeat. Josephine lifted her head and smiled. "They're here," she said softly. "They've waited long enough." Before anyone could stop her, she walked to the front door. Elizabeth screamed, rushing after her, but an invisible force held her back at the threshold. Miss Porter grabbed Josephine's wrist, desperate to restrain her, but the girl's expression calm, almost joyful, made her hand falter. Outside, in the mist of dawn, they appeared. 7 women in white, standing in a semicircle beyond the lawn, their figures wavering like heat on stone. Among them, unmistakable, stood Margaret and Catherine, their hollow eyes fixed lovingly on their sister. Their hands stretched out in welcome. Josephine stepped forward. As she reached the lawn, something impossible unfolded. From the charred stump where the oak had once stood, a green shoot pushed upward, twisting and stretching, growing into a sapling in the span of seconds. Its young branches reached skyward, pulsing with new life, as if the earth itself was reclaiming what had been lost. Josephine knelt before the sapling, placed her hands on its tender bark, and whispered a single phrase, "I'm home." In the next breath, she and the women were gone. The lawn was empty. The humming faded. The sapling still swayed in the morning breeze. Elizabeth collapsed to her knees, her screams echoing across Magnolia Hill. Josiah staggered outside, rifle trembling in his hands, but the weapon fell uselessly as he stared at the young oak. All his power, all his wealth, meant nothing. His daughters were gone, and the land itself seemed to mock him with its unexplainable growth. The Ellisons never recovered. Within weeks, Josiah abandoned his fields. Elizabeth took Sarah north to her family in Virginia. Magnolia Hill decayed, its grand halls left hollow, its fields choked with weeds. The once proud Ellison name was now spoken only in whispers, always ending with the same refrain, No Ellison daughter lived past 16. The collapse of Magnolia Hill should have been the end of the Ellison story. The house fell silent, the fields lay fallow, and by the early 1850s, the family name had all but disappeared from county records. Yet the mystery refused to die. Instead, it grew, passed from whispered memory to local legend, until curious strangers began to dig into what the Ellisons had left behind. A historian, 1890s. 1897, a University of Alabama historian named Dr. William Harcourt stumbled across newspaper clippings describing the vanishings. Skeptical but intrigued, he traveled south to investigate. He interviewed aging locals who still remembered the night of Margaret's ball, and he uncovered Miss Porter's private journals, yellowed but legible, detailing the daughter's dreams and disappearances. Dr. Harcourt's research led him further back, into county archives few bothered to consult. There he discovered references to an obscure sect of women who had settled the land decades before Josiah Ellison arrived. They were said to mix Christian hymns with older pagan rites, gathering beneath the same oak tree that later dominated Magnolia Hill. Locals accused them of witchcraft after several young men vanished. A mob stormed their compound in 1798 only to find it empty, save for a massive oak covered in carved symbols. The women were never seen again. Harcourt published his findings in a small academic journal, proposing that the Ellison vanishings were part of a much older cycle tied to the land itself. His peers dismissed the theory as fanciful, bordering on folklore. Frustrated, he returned to the site in 1900 to spend a night beneath the oak, hoping to gather evidence firsthand. His journal was found the next morning, open to a chilling final entry. Midnight, the humming has begun. I see them, women in white, faces both young and ancient. They beckon, and though I should fear, I feel only a strange sense of belonging. If this is madness, then I embrace it. I must know the truth. Dr. Harcourt was never seen again. The folklore student, 1920s. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1927, a young folklorist named Eleanor Pritchard from the Alabama Women's College chose the Ellison case for her thesis on American ghost traditions. Unlike Harcourt, she treated the story not as history, but as folklore, evolving narrative shaped by the fears and beliefs of the region. Eleanor collected oral testimonies from elderly residents and former servants. The most startling came from Bessie Johnson, once Elizabeth Ellison's maid, who by then was nearly 100 years old. Her recorded words contradicted the image of Elizabeth as an innocent victim. Miss Elizabeth knew what lived in that tree. She thought she could bargain with it. I saw her cut locks of her daughter's hair, drop their blood into a bowl, and leave it at the roots. She said it was protection. But you can't bargain with spirits. They take what they want. Eleanor's thesis, completed in 1928, reframed the Ellison vanishings as both supernatural lore and social commentary on the antebellum South. It earned praise from academics, but Eleanor herself never lived to present her work at Oxford, where she had been offered a fellowship. She vanished while photographing the oak tree, her camera and notebook left neatly at its base. The radio broadcast, 1960s. By the 1960s, the land surrounding the oak had become the target of developers. Plans for a suburban subdivision were announced, despite locals' protests. To prove the site safe, developer Howard Daniels staged a publicity stunt. He would spend the night beneath the oak and broadcast it live over local radio. The broadcast began lightly, with Daniels mocking the old ghost stories. But as midnight drew near, his tone changed. Listeners across Alabama heard him whisper, "It's quiet. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds. Wait, there's movement above me. Footsteps in the branches. And humming. Faint, but constant. My God, they're here. They're beautiful. Always waiting." Static overtook the broadcast. When the spotlight returned, Daniels was gone. His sleeping bag lay empty, his microphone still transmitting the rustling of leaves. His body was never recovered. The subdivision project was abandoned. The Paranormal Team, 2010s and 2015. A television crew from a popular paranormal investigation series secured permission to film at the Oak, now protected as a historical landmark. Equipped with infrared cameras and high-tech sensors, they camped for 3 nights. The first nights yielded strange but inconclusive results: temperature drops, unexplained audio clips of humming. But on the 3rd night, their skeptic technician, a young woman named Jordan, approached the tree on camera. Her expression shifted from detachment to wonder as she whispered, "They're talking to me. They say I belong with them. That I always have." She reached out toward the bark. Her teammates restrained her before she could touch it. Hours later, she had no memory of the event. Within months, she resigned from the show, vanished from social media, and was never located again. A pattern without end from Harcourt to Pritchard, from Daniels to Jordan. The story repeated itself. Curiosity, encounter, disappearance. Each generation added new fragments, journals, testimonies, recordings, but none provided closure. Instead, they reinforced the same conclusion locals had whispered since 1845. The women in white were still waiting, still calling. The Ellison family was gone, but their curse or covenant lived on, reaching across decades, across lives, drawing anyone who lingered too close to that tree into its circle. Today, the land where Magnolia Hill once stood is almost unrecognizable. The grand plantation house is long gone, its stones scattered, its timbers rotted into the earth. Only the oak tree remains, not the original that Josiah ordered burned, but its uncanny successor. In less than 2 centuries, it has grown into one of the largest oaks in Alabama, its trunk measuring over 30 feet in circumference, its branches spreading like a vast cathedral canopy. Botanists puzzle over it. Core samples show an age of barely 150 years, exactly when Josephine vanished, yet by size alone it should be more than 500. No natural explanation has ever satisfied. The grounds are fenced now, marked as a protected historical site. A plaque tells the story of the Ellison family in cautious, factual language. Dates, disappearances, unanswered questions. What it does not mention are the whispered warnings still passed quietly among locals. Families in the surrounding counties keep an unspoken tradition. When a girl turns 16, she is sent away for a time, visiting relatives or staying in town until her birthday passes. Better not to tempt fate. Visitors to the Oak speak of unsettling encounters. Some claim to hear faint humming when the wind dies down, as if voices weave through the leaves. Others describe sudden headaches or a sense of being watched. On rare occasions, people report glimpsing fleeting figures in white, moving just beyond the tree line. More chilling still are the artifacts that appear and vanish without pattern. A white satin slipper, pristine despite the dirt. A silver locket with a miniature portrait of a solemn girl. A leather-bound journal whose first page reads only, "They are calling me home." Those who try to photograph such objects find only blurs or shadows when the images are developed dot, and still the pattern continues. Every decade or so, someone disappears: an academic, a thrill seeker, a passerby camping too close to the fence. The searchers find nothing. The case files gather dust. But locals know what happened, and they know it will happen again, dot. So if you ever find yourself in southern Alabama, standing at the edge of those protected acres, listening as dusk settles and the cicadas fall silent, ask yourself, will you hear the humming too? Will you see the women in white waiting beneath the branches, hands outstretched in welcome? Some stories never end. Some hungers never fade. And some invitations, once answered, can never be undone. This has been Founding Chronicles. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly gone. It waits, patient and unblinking for you.